facial expression and how it shows our emotions. Foundational communication, just facial expression throughout the world has many components that are consistent across cultures. And this picture, which is not only adorable, likely between mother and baby, or at least caretaker and baby, but this is a symbol also of the universality of emotions is shown in such a young age. Shortly after a person is born into a culture, their culture starts to play a difference. So we're going to talk about the difference between the universality of an expression of our emotions versus what happens when culture gets involved. So it's again back to the nature-nurture debate, right? So now the smile, which has also been shown to physiologically uplift our mood. So it not only expresses an uplifted mood, but even if we fake it, that saying, fake it till you make it. Well, even if you do, like say, often you might be wanting to encourage somebody. And so, and also it's just polite. So you smile, even if you're feeling down, you will feel better as well. So you're not only helping another person feel better, but you end up feeling better. And the studies show it. So at this point, this is a beautiful moment of connection when often it's the mother and the child first have this smile connection. And that's an amazing moment throughout cultures. So in some philosophies, such as Buddhist philosophy, it's considered a gift to give somebody a kindness, an act of kindness. So that's universal. And also when a person has an expression, it can change not only our mood, but the behavior itself. So say you go into a store and someone just really frowns at you, you're not going to feel as positive. You might even feel mad. It's like, why is she looking at me that way? Or why is she having attitude? But as we'll learn more in cognitive behavioral therapy portion, which isn't today, but I will touch on it because it relates to emotion, that we can control our emotions much more than we think we can. And by even taking that moment, appraising the situation, taking a deep breath and going, wait a second, she doesn't even know me. I'm sure this isn't personal. She probably had a very bad day, or she might hate her job, or her child might be sick at home. So by shifting one's perspective, even you could do it in a flash of a moment, and you could train yourself to do this. Your whole mood can go from disappointment or anger to compassion and care. We had this woman at the grocery store in our neighborhood, and she always seemed really, she wasn't friendly, but she didn't seem happy. So that's the thing, is also just, we know she just wasn't happy. So my husband had even more, he goes there more often than I do. And he had a goal of getting her to smile. And so he always, always smiles anyway, but he would, ask how her day went and et cetera. But after just 3 or 4 visits, I mean, she just lights up when we come. It's really great. And you could see like her mood seems so much more positive, especially, it's like, I think she knows my husband much more than me. So it's a very positive exchange that had happened. So we have more power over our emotions. And as you can see, the reflection, we're social beings. So therefore we also have not control, but power in a good way. We can affect the mood of someone else. We can encourage someone else, even with a smile. Now, the thing is with culture, we learn also there's also norms in probably many cultures that, okay, as you get older, you might not express the extreme emotions in public, but it really depends on the culture. So in some cultures, even the level of smile, it's amazing. I personally am very uncomfortable. Well, I finally got used to it, like for photos. I didn't want to overdo it. Like for passport photos, you're not allowed to show your teeth. And I have some of the most crazy passport photos or, formal ID photos, because I'm trying for me, it's a natural smile. I'm trying to keep my mouth closed. It's actually quite hard. So I have these like strange eyes. But for someone else, they might have been told, well, don't smile too big. I had a Czech friend who was like, well, yeah, Americans smile so big. I think it's just if your mother did that, if your uncle smiled a lot, and it really depends on culture. So, and on the sad side, if you look even at, sometimes when there's a tragedy, the news will show a national mourning, people mourning at a funeral, and some places, some cultures, even often, Western depends on. I was going to say Western society, but actually, in Ireland, I'm not sure if it's that way still. But they have what's called a wake, where you purposely mourn out loud with people around, with your family around. It's actually very cathartic. It's because a person should mourn at some point, should show your emotions, express your emotions at some point. It actually affects health. I'll mention that more later. There's studies showing that. So it's actually very healthy, but there's also other cultures I've seen where some Eastern cultures more. Anybody have a suggestion for a country? I forgot which country it was, but it was in the Middle East somewhere. There was something very sad, and people were very open with their mourning. Again, that can be very healthy. It's just a cultural choice. Whereas maybe in Japan or even parts of the U.S., for a funeral, you don't show. You might allow yourself quiet tears, but you wouldn't wail. So that's another example of cultural norms. So that's the nurture aspect of emotion. But again, if we overdo it, it's one thing what you're going to show in public, fine. But as long as the person at some point then is allowed to express themselves or lets themselves, even in private, mourn, they're healthier. That's where music therapy can come into play. Different ways of just letting it out is very important. I talk about the gender differences. Well, we'll get to gender in a moment. And I know I feel really sad when the boys are said not to cry, but I'll talk about pros and cons of that. There's I believe, more cons if the person isn't at least some point allowed to cry in public, right? But let's just before we jump to that, there's a term called facial feedback hypothesis. So the idea that as we alluded to before, they communicate something, but they also affect our subjective emotions. So I gave the example in the store. So that store shop person communicated something unconsciously or not intentionally, I'm sure, but by their expression. And then we can allow a negative feeling, or we can consciously learn to control our subjective response. But especially if you know somebody well too, that can hurt more, right? If somebody that you love, they also might have something bad they don't want to bother you with, but you might take it personally. So it's just important to be aware of. So Tompkins did a lot of work on this in 1962. So one of the components of emotional intelligence is called emotional regulation. And this is your response to your own emotions and how you can regulate your own emotions, as the word suggests. Again, music is very effective with that. We do it all. We all do it in a sense with our music choices. We walk around with our phones and our music and our headphones. I'm sure that most of us will consciously make a decision. Sometimes we might not realize we're choosing that piece in order to elevate our mood. Now, why do you think we often like sad songs? Anybody have a theory on that or idea? Why are we drawn to sad songs if we, if the goal in life is to feel happy? Why wouldn't we listen to happy songs all the time? I mean, you don't have to answer, but
It might be that people like that it's being acknowledged, like the sadness that they feel in the song.
sure, you can feel like, yeah, you're not alone. And yeah, there's an acknowledgement of, yeah, it's okay to feel that way. Good. Good. Alec?
I was gonna say that people can relate to it. If, a sad song is singing about like, a lost loved one or a bad breakup, people are like, oh, I can relate to that, and they listen to it for that specific reason.
Yeah, good. Yeah. So both comments are very, very valid. And also a very sad song, and people might not do this as consciously, but in a therapeutic situation, or it might happen accidentally, where you haven't allowed yourself to fully express your emotion. You just want to push it aside, the sad feelings, and a very sad song comes on, and finally you start to cry and cry. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but I have, and it's very relief. It's a release. But often in music therapy, that is on purpose, to help that person release their sadness, their mourning, and allow a healthy mourning. Because again, you don't want to often feel those. It's scary to feel those. So it allows a safe space to feel those important emotions, and also where you then don't feel embarrassed or alone, especially if you're in your room by yourself. And I think it's maybe if the boy is told, if a male more often is told not to cry, express their emotions as much, at least if I wish the same parent could have a psychology course so that they say to their son, but really don't, in public, but don't keep it in when you're by yourself. You can put on a sad song, Johnny. I wish there were I don't know, parenting courses that really taught these things, because I worry about people not expressing themselves. And anyway, so yeah, so it's very important. So this is an important component of emotional intelligence and of well-being, and suppressing even just the facial expression, which we often do in public. We're like, we don't want to over express ourselves. We're often trained not to do that. I noticed living in England also, it was very, you're kind of taught. It's apparently starting to change. The idea of hugging and letting yourself show your emotion is changing. So interesting, right? If you suppress, these are studies, Gross, Levinson, Golden, and then also later Richards and Gross looked at how it affected memory. But by not expressing, not allowing just even facial expression. Remember I was saying how just even a smile has a physiological benefit, so do tears. So by suppressing or holding that back, it actually increases. You think, okay, I'm holding it together. Have you ever seen anybody, they almost look like they're overdoing it, holding it together, but they look awkward? It's like a drunk person. They're like trying extra hard not to look drunk, so they're walking extra carefully. It's almost the same. Inside, more is going on. The autonomics, you can physiologically measure this. So it's a really good, you have people coming in, imagine the study. People come in, they see a sad film or a terrible pictures, or or happy pictures, whatever. They're told, well, don't show your expression, right? But they're being measured. Their physiological response is being measured. And so autonomic arousal is the fight and flight, right? So there's also a new element, fight or flight, but there's also freeze can be a response of some people and animals as well. But the autonomic arousal is going on even more when you're holding that back. It's like by that facial expression allows a balance, but if you cut that off, then inside there's more going on, more tension, and it's like inside, and the amygdala activation. Amygdala is the part of the brain that's associated with emotion, and often sadness, and not necessarily sadness, but often the fear and the anxiety and sadness activates the amygdala. So that is actually activated more by holding it in. Isn't that interesting? So yes, if of course you don't want to show the whole world your expressions, but don't hold it back too often. Or sometimes people also feel that if you hold back your emotion too often, then they feel you're fake, or it can affect relationships. I think I've had to learn how to hold my emotion back more, but I've had people tell me they appreciate that I'm honest with my emotions, so they feel there's an honesty there, and it is healthier. But yeah, and so holding back emotions can actually, who would have thought, right, impair your memory. It's just, and by the way, the hippocampus, which is the portion of the brain responsible for memory, is right next to the amygdala. emotion and memory are very connected. And so that's also shown in the music psychology literature, that why certain emotional songs can actually help us remember something or trigger a memory. So anyway, so you'll keep in mind, it's very important to express yourself. Madonna had a song years ago, "Express Yourself." Check it out. She has a really good video. I haven't seen it in ages, but anyway, it's good. Okay. Now, gender, emotion, gender, culture. We talked about culture. Now, related to what I've mentioned many times about the boys aren't encouraged to cry and even to hug or express themselves. So, and the dangers, I've mentioned the dangers of it. One aspect, though, that can be helpful, again, as long as the boy is told to let it out at some point, but they're often not told that. When you learn to hold it in, at least initially, it can train a person to do what's called front-end assessment of emotion, like responses to something where you're appraising the situation, which is helpful, say in that store example, to appraise like, well, let me take a breath, and instead of yelling at her or giving her a dirty look back, let me take a breath and think about, well, more logically about it before I respond emotionally, versus back end response, just responding quickly. So if you're never told to hold your emotion, and maybe you might just respond too quickly. So there is a disadvantage to at least taking that deep breath initially and appraising the situation. Our most famous psychologist of all, of course, Freud, he overgeneralized with it's pretty much common agreement that as brilliant as he was, and as much of a contribution he made to, say, for example, consciousness, which we'll talk about next week, he did overgeneralize the gender, and he didn't maybe take into account the social norms that were expected of men versus women. So he called women, hysterical, not the most positive gender assessments, and not the most accurate. So that's not his more positive legacy, but he has other wonderful contributions. So, and hey, he started to talk about it. He started the conversation maybe in a way that others hadn't. So it's all good. His daughter, Anna Freud, really contributed a lot, developmental psychology, especially, but anyway, other areas as well. So now, so that's why I'm going to say, because certain studies have shown that women have more often the back end response, and men, or at least more often, the front end response. And that's why I gave the big preface about nature nurture, rather probably more likely due to nurture, because also there are studies showing that, well, on the other hand, in terms of hormonal influence, there's also estrogen that's what maybe Freud would like to focus on with women, but there's also testosterone, where men might have more difficulty at a certain point with anger. There's discussion about that. There's research still being done, but regardless, neither emotion doesn't really say a character of a person. A person can take an angry nature, whether you're male or female, and turn that into positive by anger at injustice, anger at the polluted water in your town. So you're going to go and fight for the children of your town to make sure that there's no lead in their water. I'm going to fight this through. So Martin Luther King, some of the best activists in the world had anger, used it in a good way. So, so you could think of different emotions as neutral, as long as you use it well, if you use it to create value and to also make sure that you take care of your health. So, so again, there's stereotypes, as I mentioned. Again, Freud fell into that rabbit hole, but again, you could see, and I keep emphasizing the cultural influence. But now there's an interesting study that in this page 398 in the book, and for some reason the author isn't there. But what's interesting is, and this shows that we are actually, males and females, experiencing the same emotion but responding differently. So when Males and females in a certain study were asked what their emotion was in the moment, basically equal. So we basically feel the same way. We're the same species. It's just that when they're asked how they felt in the very moment, we're the same. So again, the back end, front end processes and learning how to regulate and express your emotions is where it gets different, and that's due to socialization, is what I would propose strongly, and many others also agree. So we talked about cultural differences and the collectivist versus individualistic cultures might speak about emotions in a different way and maybe focus on different aspects in terms of looking at the overall culture. So collectivist culture is very much about a relationship. So one might look at, hey, the commonality among us, which is very good to do. So again, East Asian countries, or a lot of Asian countries, are very collectivist, and it's a very healthy thing to look at our similarities. Western cultures, European and American, often individualistic, maybe honor that, maybe more, or focus on that. So might say, well, but our emotional responses make us unique. I think ideally there's a balance between the two, because it's true. We're human beings. We really share this commonality. It's very important. But hey, we can celebrate our difference. We all have different personalities. So actually, a person can try to find a balance between the two. But in general, collectivist and versus individualistic cultures will even view emotion differently. So that is the section on emotion. For the next hour, after that, we're going to talk about intelligence. I'll focus on different ways of looking at intelligence, and it's very interesting. We'll speak a little bit about measuring it, but mostly we'll look at, again, multiple intelligence theory and other theories on intelligence. All right, so how do we define it, right? There's so many ways to define it. There's the typical way that people have done for a long time. The classic mathematical skill and linguistic skill. Those are two large categories that people tend to focus on. But there are many ways to look at it, and so that's what we'll discuss. Different perspectives and aspects of intelligence. I've mentioned briefly is different across species too. We have different forms of intelligence. None of us could come close to the intelligence, spatial, temporal reasoning ability of a bird, most birds, or the olfactory sensitivity of a pig or a dog, or the dog's ability to recognize epileptic attack before it happens. I mean, just amazing things that animals can do that we are not able to do. So again, there's different ways of thinking and being in this world. The broader thing, a very broad view is just simply, does the person or even being or any being but learn from that experience? That takes that's a form of intelligence. If something happens to you over and over and you still do the same thing, that's not very helpful in life. So that alone is very important. Abstract thought, dealing with your environment. Of course, that's how we adapted to the environment. Whatever form a species is in has been the victor in adapting to their environment, unless they've been genetically modified by humans. But briefly, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. You're going to have, in terms of details of measurement, I'll talk in a more general sense on it. But it's important to make note of, because maybe the most famous, at least for Americans, but it also probably in Europe, because it started in France by a scientist named educator Binet, who created what we know now is the IQ test, intelligence quotient test. And it was decent. It was the first of its kind to be able to I believe the history in France was, I think, to categorize children to help them. I think it was for positive reasons, but the details are actually interesting. I just haven't read about them in a while. But in the US, there's an interesting history and elsewhere, of how it was discovered that, if you think of it, the most recent immigrant population initially, based on these tests, appear to be less intelligent. But upon closer inspection, one needs to look at the test itself. If the test, first of all, language, if it's not your first language, that's a disadvantage. Secondly, if there are cultural references and if the problem-solving questions relate to the culture that the person is not familiar with, that doesn't test their intelligence. It tests the fact that they just arrived to the country. So then there was an awareness of you need to erase as much as possible cultural references and take into account the language ability, etc. So they have been improved. So there is supposed non-culturally biased versions out there. There's also versions, I mentioned spatial temporal reasoning. It's something I studied in my PhD work, particularly in relation to mathematical understanding. But it's also these tests are out there because they're in recognition of other ways of thinking, and it takes that form of thinking, spatial temporal reasoning, is great for computer building, robotics, space, NASA, a person who's going to be a rocket scientist. I mean, it's very, very great skill, and it does affect mathematical ability. But it also, when you test this, you're testing a different way of looking. So, for example, if somebody is just dyslexic or maybe nonlinear way of reading or thinking, this is another way to look at intelligence. So that has also been used for that. So this is just up here that you'll have in your research class and your statistics classes, but it is important to make sure the test is reliable and has validity. So the test itself needs to be tested. The test itself needs to be up for scrutiny, as I gave the example of the original IQ test. Any test that's created, you have to also test it out on the population. You get what's called a standardized score in relation to what the average person in the country, for example, all the tests I used in England had been tested with thousands of children in England around the same age, or they were age standardized, so that the average 8-year-old, for example, should get this score. Therefore, if a student got something higher, they were above average, etc. So you standardize the test, you really test the tests. So that's just a general importance to know. And as you can see, these are ways of different aspects of validity, which you will learn more in those other courses I just mentioned. But it's important just to mention it, that these also have to live up to the scrutiny. And so other assessments of intellectual abilities, Wechsler intelligence scale is very common and used. So the Stanford-Binet, as I was mentioning, because Binet, Stanford got involved later, it was initiated by Binet, but the language ability, yes, so it's the Wechsler tests, again, were an improvement in the sense that they made language less of a instance. In fact, there was a time in history around this time they were being used. There were a lot of immigrants from Poland at the time, and so initially they were misassessed. And again, language is, of course, a huge factor. So this tries to take. They have a spatial test, for example, that I didn't use for my study because it didn't have the rotational sequencing element of the spatial temporal. But anyway, they're very good. They're used quite often. Of course, Stanford-Binet test has been improved as well. But Wechsler has now become quite accepted. And the Spearman, just a lot of ideas came out of this idea of the general intelligence versus specific intelligence, that some have a general intelligence of just generally learning well, generally problem solving well, regardless of subject. Others, although the extreme of the other opposite is like a savant, somebody who might not be great at certain topics, but brilliant in another. I don't know if anybody saw the movie or heard of the movie Rain Man. The actor Dustin Hoffman did an amazing job. I think I was a kid. I don't know. It's got accolades as being a very good movie, but it was about a man who had severe, I'm not sure if it was autism, but it was very extreme. so that he wasn't even, able to maybe speak properly, etc. But he was a genius in mathematics. So anyway, so that's the extreme of more, again, called savant. So there's either great at certain areas, or this general intelligence that Spearman spoke about. Again, I'm not going to go into statistics here, but those things do need to be used. It's important. I talk about statistics, for research itself is always important. So Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence is super important, super famous. You might, if you Google it, you might see that he had 7, you might see that he had 8, but ultimately he came upon 9. 9 is his final number. He added the last 2 after his initial theory was put forth, and he breaks them up into these categories. And so you have other beyond linguistic, there's musical, and we already talked about mathematical intelligence, but spatial, bodily kinesthetic. I mean, the athletes, for example, in this country, it's a small country, people are always in the Olympics. It's just genius, kinesthetic geniuses, fabulous at sports and eye-hand coordination and another form of intelligence. And also, we have out of in the non-human animal world, cats are genius athletes too. Their sense of balance. I don't know if some of you have cats, right? We just saw an adorable one that was adopted kindly by the kitty's new mommy. But they think before they jump. They kind of analyze, the height and how much strength do I need. What trajectory should I use? It's fun to see their minds working. Intrapersonal, knowing thyself, Socrates talked about it, and we're learning that in psychology. Interpersonal, like relationships, that's also important for psychology. Social skills that people, even politician or other types of careers, that's good for. Naturalistic, so I'm a forest ranger, a gardener, somebody who works with animals, or somebody who just understands nature. In America, we have a saying called that she has a green thumb. Like, she's really good at gardening, she has a green thumb. And some people joke that, oh, I don't have a green thumb. So it's a phrase that's used. Is there any similar phrase in Czechia or elsewhere, or from your country, if you're not from here? Okay, well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting how one thing I found is that famous sayings in one I found was very interesting. We say, at least in America, if you're putting yourself in someone else's shoes, if you're learning how to be compassionate for someone else, and then there's a saying in Czechia that's putting yourself in someone else's skin, I think, which is fascinating. Anyway, then existential, like the philosopher, somebody who's great at philosophy. But again, that's related to psychology. Philosophical questions such as what is the mind, how the mind works, has been around pre-psychology and has now been adapted to psychology using more methodological ways to verify theories. So here we go, I'm turning it into a science. Other theory is Sternberg's triarchic theory. He looks at 3 ways of thinking. There's analytical thinking, carefully identifying and evaluating a problem, creative intelligence, thinking outside the box, and innovative solutions to problems, and also then practical intelligence, being able to carry it out. So if we think of, say, Steve Jobs, the person who invented the iPhone, this is an Android, but it symbolizes the iPhone. I mean, he had these like creative, amazing ideas. Why people should have a computer in their own home. People should be able to walk around with it in their phone. Crazy ideas that he wasn't able to himself implement. He had some knowledge, but he wouldn't be able to implement it. But he told people on his team, make it work, make it somehow. I just know somehow it's possible. He knew enough basic knowledge to make it possible. So every kind of intelligence is very important. Analytical, a lot of people with practical intelligence also tend to be analytical as well, but not necessarily. So Sternberg looked at intelligence this way. How do you think? How do you solve problems? And so this is also valid. Emotional intelligence. So we're coming back to it. We focused on emotional regulation, which is one of the forms, but let's look at the other three. So even just to perceive the emotions and the expression of emotions of others can help you, live life better, but it's an element of emotional intelligence. You're able to anticipate threats. You're able to be kinder and empathize with others. So there's many advantages to that. It also helps you too if you can, evaluate correctly those around you. It comes back to you as well, and form better relationships, etc. And then also being able to even to use your own emotions and access them, and even say, for example, accessing your compassion, allowing sometimes yourself to feel so that you can encourage or comfort somebody properly, or to be able to problem solve and think correctly. So if you're able to anticipate future feelings, for example, that can really help your decision-making process. When we talked about critical thinking, for example, we talked about how and Brookfield, in fact, noted that it's critical thinking isn't this cold, objective thinking that doesn't involve emotions. It can require emotions. So when you all decided on majoring in psychology, which I think most of you are, what helped you make a good decision was your heart as well as your mind. So recognizing that, I feel good. I'm really interested in this topic, and it feels good when I help others, or it feels good when I understand my own mind better. All these things are related to feeling as well. If you just, hated this topic, it wouldn't have been the best choice. And in the long run, it probably wouldn't work out for you. So that's an example that you've all gone through in a sense, in some form or another, possibly with deciding on a university. So then on the topic, yeah, so understanding emotions themselves and their meaning. This is great for psychologists and help others to perceive your own emotions and others. Why am I feeling this way? To define it and to be able to therefore understand or resolve a potential problem. That is very important in life. And as we discussed, emotional regulation is very helpful to manage and regulate your emotions appropriately. And this one's maybe talked about more often because it is a practical skill that can relate to the others, and that you can learn. Everyone can get better at all four of these categories. But this one has been studied a lot and is very important and doable, kind of more accessible in a sense. So here is what the research shows, is that people with higher emotional intelligence tend to be healthier both psychologically and physically. So well-being in general, again, affects our health, and our health can clearly affect our well-being. So, but those with this type of intelligence, which is actually still being studied, there's a lot of research still to be done in emotional intelligence, but it's completely recognized. Again, super important stuff. And to end that, this portion, I want to focus on this little guy who is really enjoying his moment in the spotlight. He's, represents, this is a nice parade, and he has his own moment there. So let's learn to enjoy, let's work with ourselves, our own emotions, our own thinking in service of lifting, elevating our life state, and enjoy life's parade like this little guy is doing.